They called him the Prince of the Pit, a man who could turn a few $1,000s into hundreds of millions before most people had even learned what a futures contract was. Chicago, 1983. The trading floor was chaos, paper flying, men shouting, sweat, adrenaline, fear, greed, all compressed into a few square feet. And in the middle of it all stood Richard Dennis, calm as stone, watching the tides of human emotion rise and crash around him. To most, it was madness. To him, it was music. He wasn't born into wealth privilege. He started with $1,600, borrowed, scraped together, and turned it into over 200 million in less than a decade. The newspapers called him a genius. The traders whispered his name like a myth. But behind the myth, Dennis had a question that would divide the world of trading forever. Can trading really be taught? His best friend, William Eckhard, didn't think so. Eckhard believed traders were born, not made. You either had the instinct or you didn't. No amount of rules could replace the feel of the market's pulse, but Dennis disagreed. He believed trading was not magic, it was logic, that anyone, if trained the right way, could learn it. And so one evening in a quiet Chicago restaurant, over a small table scattered with notes and a half-finished coffee, the two men made a bet. It wasn't about money, it was about truth, about whether human nature could be reprogrammed. Dennis smiled and said, "I'll teach people how to trade and I'll prove it works." Eckhart leaned back, skeptical. "You really think you can take ordinary people and turn them into market wizards?" Dennis replied, "Yes, because markets aren't about prediction, they're about discipline." A few months later, he placed an ad in the newspapers. Richard Dennis is looking for trainees, no experience required. Thousands applied, college students, scientists, accountants, even a security guard. They called them the Turtles, inspired by the turtle farms Dennis had seen in Singapore. He said he could grow traders just like they grew turtles. Fast, consistent, predictable. Out of the thousands, only 13 were chosen. They came from every walk of life, united by one thing: curiosity. When they arrived in Chicago, they expected magic. What they got was method. The first lesson Dennis gave them wasn't about charts or trends. It was about emotion. If you can't follow rules, no system will save you, he said. If you can, even a simple system will make you rich. The training was short, just 2 weeks. But those 2 weeks changed the way people thought about trading forever. Every day began early, the turtles sitting in a small classroom with yellow notepads and calculators. Dennis stood at the front, writing on a whiteboard. "Trend following," he said. "That's all we do. The trend is your friend until it ends." The students scribbled notes furiously. He showed them how to buy when the price broke out of a range, how to sell when it fell below, how to size their positions, how to let profits run and cut losses quickly. No guessing, no predicting, only reacting. It sounded too simple, but the real test was never the system. It was the human behind it. On the third day, Dennis paused and looked at them. "The market doesn't care what you think," he said. "It doesn't care if you're right. It only cares if you can survive." He told them stories of traders who had blown up accounts because they couldn't accept small losses. "Ego kills faster than ignorance," he warned. The room was silent. Everyone wrote the words down. At night, some of the trainees stayed up late trying to simulate trades on paper, calculating what could happen if they followed every rule. Others doubted. "Can it really be this easy?" one asked. Another replied, "It's not easy. It's simple. There's a difference." They were learning that trading wasn't about being smart, it was about being consistent. By the end of the second week, Dennis handed each of them a small account, real money, hundreds of thousands of dollars to trade with. He told them, "You're not trading to win, you're trading to last. Every trade is just one of 1,000. Follow the rules." They nodded, some confident, some terrified. The moment had come. The experiment was alive. When the markets opened that Monday morning, the turtles took their first positions. Fingers trembled on keyboards, quotes flickered, prices surged and dropped. One by one, they placed orders according to the system. No feelings, no second guessing, just numbers, rules, and execution. And as the days went by, something astonishing happened. Some of them began making money, real money. Within weeks, one doubled his account. Another turned 100,000 into 500. Others, however, started losing. The same system, the same rules, different results. Dennis gathered them again and said, the difference between success and failure isn't knowledge, it's psychology. The market tests your patience, your fear, your greed every single day. If you can't control yourself, you'll lose, even if the system is perfect. He paused. This game isn't about the market, it's about you. Outside, snow was falling over Chicago. Inside, a new generation of traders was being born, not through instinct, but through discipline. Yet, even as they learned to conquer their emotions, Dennis himself was beginning to face his own battle. He'd proven his point. The system worked. But could he always follow it himself? The question lingered like a shadow, waiting for the next storm to come. The snow outside thickened, wrapping Chicago in a white silence. But inside Dennis's office, the tension was sharp. Charts covered the walls, red and green lines carving the rise and fall of human emotion. He stood by the window, arms folded, watching the steam from his coffee curl into the air. Behind him, one of the turtles spoke softly. Mr. Dennis, what happens if the system stops working? Dennis didn't turn around. The system never stops working, he said. Only the people running it do. He believed that rules were stronger than fear. But as markets shifted and rumors spread, even he began to feel the pulse quicken. The markets were alive, wild, unpredictable, and the turtles, his students, were now out there, battling it. Some were winning, some were crumbling. The experiment had escaped the lab. One of them, a quiet man named Curtis, called him late one night. Richard, he said, I followed every rule. I cut losses fast. I let profits run, but I'm down this week. Did I do something wrong? Dennis smiled faintly. You did everything right. Losing is part of winning. You can't control the outcome. You can only control your process. There was a pause, and then Dennis added, if you need to be right, you'll never survive. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The turtles began making headlines. Newspapers called them the trading experiment that worked. One turned 10,000 into 500,000. Another managed risk so precisely it looked like magic. But Dennis knew it wasn't magic. It was obedience. Pure, mechanical obedience. The kind most humans couldn't maintain for long. He walked through the office one afternoon and heard laughter, the kind of laughter that comes from success. He paused, watching his students celebrate a winning streak. Be careful, he said quietly. The market rewards arrogance before it destroys it. They nodded, but few truly heard him. Everyone thinks they're invincible after a good trade. That night he wrote in his journal, discipline is fragile. Even when proven, it's easily broken by success. He closed the book and stared at the city lights. For years, he'd fought to prove that trading could be taught. Now he was realizing that teaching it was the easy part. Keeping it alive inside a person, that was the real challenge. The crash came quietly. It didn't announce itself. It crept in like fog. Prices began to slide, then tumble, then spiral. The same systems that once printed money now delivered pain. Some turtles froze, others panicked. Phone calls poured in. Richard, should we hold? Should we cut? The signals are everywhere. He said the same words again and again. Follow the rules. Nothing else matters. But it was hard to follow rules when fear takes the wheel. One by one, they broke them. Early exits, oversized positions, revenge trades. Dennis watched as emotion devoured logic. He could almost see it in their eyes. The desperate need to be right, to win back control of something uncontrollable. And yet, amid the chaos, a few stayed calm. They took the losses as lessons, the pain as tuition. They understood what Dennis had really taught them. Not a trading system, but a way of thinking. You're not fighting the market, he had said. You're fighting yourself. Those who remembered survived. Those who forgot vanished. After the storm, Dennis called them all back to Chicago. The room was quieter this time. No excitement, no applause. Only reflection. You've seen what happens when you break the rules, he said. Now you understand why most traders fail. It's not knowledge they lack. It's control. The hardest thing to master is not the chart. It's your own mind. He looked around the room. Some faces were weary, others humbled. A few were proud. What did you learn? He asked. One voice answered, that fear is louder than reason. Another said, that patience is harder than prediction. Dennis nodded. Good. Then you've learned the truth. After they left, he stayed behind, alone with the hum of the fluorescent lights. He poured another cup of coffee and stared at the trading screen. The numbers flickered like fireflies, indifferent to everything he'd done. He whispered almost to himself, Can trading really be taught? For the first time, he wasn't sure. Years passed. Some of the turtles went on to build fortunes. Others faded into silence. Their paths diverged, but their roots remained in that tiny classroom where Dennis drew simple lines on a whiteboard and spoke about discipline like a sacred law. The experiment had proven its point, at least on paper. But the deeper lesson was harder to measure. When asked later what he thought about his own creation, Dennis said, "I taught them the rules. What I couldn't teach was how to believe in them when the world goes mad." He smiled softly. Maybe that's something you have to learn alone. Outside, the markets kept breathing, pulsing, shifting, just as they always had. For every trader who found calm, 10 more drowned in emotion. The system remained the same. The human heart did not. And somewhere in the quiet between tick and tock, between buy and sell, the question still waited. Can trading really be taught, or can it only be lived? Years later, long after the noise of the trading pits had faded into history, Richard Dennis sat in a quiet office with only the hum of computers for company. The markets had changed. Electronic, faster, colder, but the human heartbeat behind every trade was the same. He scrolled through charts, watching the lines rise and fall like tides that no one could command. Somewhere deep down, he knew he was no longer fighting numbers. He was fighting ghosts. Memories of a time when he believed discipline could defeat emotion. A young trader knocked on his door. "Mr. Dennis," he said, nervous but eager, "I've read everything about the turtle experiment. Do you still think trading can be taught?" Dennis smiled faintly. "You can teach a man to read the waves," he said, "but you can't teach him not to drown." The young man frowned. "So it's hopeless?" Dennis shook his head. "No, it's human, and that's the difference." He poured coffee, the same ritual he had followed for decades. The smell carried him back to the classrooms, the chalk dust, the faces of the students who had believed him when he said that rules were enough. Some of them still called now and then, the ones who had survived. They spoke in the calm tone of people who had learned to lose without breaking. They didn't talk about money, they talked about peace. He once believed success was measured in numbers. Now he saw it in silence, in how still a trader could remain when everything around him burned. He looked at the screen, saw a flash of green, then red. A trade triggered. He didn't react. "The market is the world's greatest teacher," he murmured. "It just charges the highest tuition." Outside, the sky dimmed. The city lights shimmered like small candles against the dark. Dennis leaned back, remembering the first turtle class, the questions, the doubts, the faces bright with ambition. He remembered telling them, "Your biggest enemy is not the market, it's yourself," and how some of them nodded, but didn't really understand until they lost more than they thought they could bear. He had watched people with genius minds fall apart because they couldn't handle boredom. He had seen ordinary people become extraordinary simply because they obeyed their own rules longer than anyone else could. He opened an old folder on his desk. Yellowed papers, handwritten notes from the 1980s. On the top page, one sentence was underlined. "The rules are easy. The execution is everything." He traced the words with his finger. "You were right," he whispered to his younger self, "but you didn't know how heavy that truth would become." The young trader was still there, standing awkwardly. "Mr. Dennis, what do you do when you start doubting the rules?" Dennis looked up slowly. "You don't fight the doubt," he said. "You let it speak, then you trade anyway. The rules are your anchor when your mind wants to drift. You won't always believe in them, but they'll still believe in you." He saw the confusion in the boy's eyes and smiled again. "You think trading is about money? It's not. It's about character. Every dollar you make or lose is a mirror. The market doesn't reward brilliance, it rewards discipline. The world has too many smart people and too few steady ones." The trader left, and the office fell silent again. Dennis stared out the window at the frozen skyline. He thought of William Eckhart, his old friend, the one who had doubted him. They hadn't spoken in years. Maybe, he thought, they had both been right in different ways. You can teach a method, but not the patience to endure it. You can hand someone a map, but you can't make them walk the road when it turns uphill. He remembered the crash of '87, the losses that had almost destroyed him. The headlines, the whispers. The man who taught others to win couldn't follow his own rules. It had cut deep. But with time, he stopped feeling shame. He realized that even he had to relearn his own lessons. Discipline, he muttered, isn't something you have, it's something you practice. The years had humbled him. He no longer chased the rush of profits or the applause of journalists. He traded small now quietly for the art of it. The rhythm soothed him. Tick, tock, rise, fall. It was meditation, not conquest. Sometimes he thought of the turtles scattered across the world, some wealthy, some forgotten. He imagined them sitting in their own quiet rooms, staring at the same kind of screens, feeling the same flicker of hope and fear. They were all still students, just older ones. He picked up the phone and called one of them. Curtis, the quiet one. "Do you ever miss it?" Dennis asked. Curtis laughed softly. "Miss what? The noise or the fear?" Dennis smiled. "Both." Curtis said, "Sometimes. But I learned something you once told us. The market doesn't owe you anything. Gratitude keeps you sane." They spoke for a while, two voices drifting between nostalgia and wisdom. When the call ended, Dennis sat in silence. He realized that the experiment had never really ended. Every trader who read about it, every student who tried to follow its rules was part of it now. The turtle idea lived on, not as a formula, but as a philosophy. He stood, walked to the window, and watched the snow fall through the city lights. "You can't teach emotion," he said quietly, "but you can teach awareness. And maybe that's enough." He turned off the monitors one by one until only the reflection of his face remained in the dark glass. Time had taken his youth but left him clarity. Somewhere in the distance, another market opened. Orders flew, charts moved. The same dance began again, the eternal contest between logic and fear, between what we know and what we feel. Dennis whispered, "The system is timeless, the trader is temporary." He walked away from the desk, leaving the screens alive behind him. The room glowed softly, a heartbeat of numbers pulsing in the dark. For a long moment, he stood in the doorway and listened, to the hum, to the silence, to the echo of his own question still lingering after all these years. "Can trading really be taught?" He smiled faintly. "Maybe," he said to no one. "But living it, that's the real lesson." The night was long, and the city was quiet, except for the faint hum of traffic and the occasional flicker of light from passing cars. Richard Dennis sat in his chair, staring at an old monitor that glowed like a fading ember. The screen was filled with charts, lines, and numbers, but to him they were no longer just data. They were echoes of every decision, every doubt, every heartbeat that once defined his life. He whispered, "The market never changes. Only we do." He thought of the faces that once surrounded him, the turtles, young and eager, eyes full of wonder and fear. He could still hear their questions. "When do we know it's the right time to buy?" one had asked. "When you stop needing to be right," he had answered. Another had asked, "What if we lose everything?" He had smiled then. "Then you start again. That's what traders do." Those moments felt close, like ghosts leaning over his shoulder. His phone buzzed on the table. A message from an old student. "Richard, I'm teaching a new class on trend following. You'd be proud." He smiled faintly. The irony wasn't lost on him. The student teaching the teacher's method long after the teacher had stopped believing in perfection. He typed back slowly, "Pride doesn't belong in trading, but I'm glad you're passing it on." He leaned back, the leather creaking under his weight. The office was dim, lit only by the soft orange of a desk lamp. The walls were lined with photographs, grainy shots from the 1980s, newspaper clippings, his younger self in the chaos of the pit. One photo caught his eye. Him and William Eckhard, laughing after a long day. He remembered their bet. He remembered the certainty in his voice when he said anyone could be taught. He wondered now if that certainty had been youth, not truth. He whispered, "We were both right, weren't we, Bill?" The room didn't answer. Only the low hum of the machines filled the silence. "You can teach the rules," he said softly, "but you can't teach conviction." He picked up the photo, studied it for a while, then set it down gently. "You win," he said under his breath. He stood and walked to the window. Snowflakes drifted slowly through the glow of the city lights. He watched them fall, each one different, unpredictable, yet all following the same law of gravity. It reminded him of traders, all unique, all drawn by the same invisible pull of greed and fear. "We all fall the same way," he said quietly, "just at different speeds." He closed his eyes and listened. In his mind, the roar of the trading floor came back, the shouting, the chaos, the endless stream of numbers. He could almost feel the heat again, the pulse of adrenaline. But beneath it, he heard something deeper, the rhythm he had once felt in his bones, the rhythm of trends. It had always been there, beneath the noise. That rhythm had made him rich. That rhythm had nearly destroyed him. He returned to his desk and opened a journal. The pages were filled with notes, scattered thoughts, bits of wisdom collected over decades. He flipped to the last page and wrote slowly, "Discipline is not control. It's surrender to the truth." He paused, thinking, then added, "And truth doesn't need to be perfect to work." He closed the book, exhaled, and let his hand rest on it as if sealing a lifetime into a single sentence. He looked up at the screens again. The markets were alive, pulsing with movement. Somewhere out there, someone was making their first trade, heart pounding, hands trembling. Somewhere else, another was blowing up their account, learning pain the hard way. He smiled. "The same dance," he murmured. "New dancers." His phone rang again. It was another turtle, one he hadn't spoken to in years. He answered. "Richard," a voice said, older now, cautious, "I wanted to say thank you. What you taught me, it saved me." Dennis chuckled softly. "I taught you how to lose," he said. "That's what really saved you." The man on the line laughed. "Maybe that's what I needed most." They spoke for a while, not about trades or money, but about time, patience, and the strange beauty of uncertainty. When the call ended, Dennis sat quietly, letting the words linger like warm smoke. He poured himself another cup of coffee. His hands shook slightly now, not from nerves, but from age. He stared at the dark liquid and smiled. "Still the same taste," he whispered. "Still bitter, still perfect." He walked back to the window, the cup warming his hands. Outside, dawn was creeping in, soft and gray. He watched the sky shift from black to blue and thought of all the mornings he had watched charts instead of sunrises. "You gave me everything," he said to the market, "and took just as much." He thought of those who would come after him, the new generation with faster tools, smarter algorithms, more data than he ever dreamed of. But he knew none of it would matter. "Technology changes," he said, "but fear doesn't. Greed doesn't. That's why the market will always win." He smiled again, not with regret, but with peace. And that's why it's beautiful. He returned to his desk, shut down the screens one by one until the room dimmed to quiet darkness. The hum faded. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the need to watch. The market would move without him. It always had. It always would. He sat still for a long time, listening to his own breathing, slow and steady. Then, almost unconsciously, he spoke aloud. "In the end, the experiment wasn't about teaching others to trade. It was about teaching myself to let go." The words hung in the air, soft and final. He took a deep breath, reached for his coat, and stood. As he walked toward the door, the light from the window caught his reflection, older, smaller, but still carrying the same quiet fire. He smiled at the image. "Discipline," he whispered, "the one thing that never expires." And then he turned off the last light, stepped into the silence of the hallway, and left the room behind, leaving the screens, the charts, the echoes of numbers still glowing faintly in the dark, beating like a heart that would never truly stop. The hallway was quiet except for the soft sound of his footsteps. Each step echoed like a fading memory. Richard Dennis walked slowly, his hand brushing the wall as if touching the past. He thought about how many years had passed since those wild days in the pit, the shouting, the sweat, the impossible rush of trading. Everything was different now. Yet inside him, the same pulse still beat, that hunger to understand what moved people, not just prices. He stepped outside. The cold air hit his face, sharp and clean. The city was waking up, lights flickering on in tall buildings, the streets stretching into motion. He stood there for a while, coffee in one hand, silence in the other. "So this is it," he whispered. "All those years, and it still feels like the first trade." He walked down the street, passing strangers who had no idea who he was. Once, his name had filled newspapers. Once, people had called him a genius. But now he liked the anonymity. The market had given him wealth, but anonymity gave him peace. "Fame is noise," he murmured. "Silence is profit." He turned a corner and stopped by a small cafe, the same place he used to visit decades ago when the world was younger and his dreams were loud. The waiter recognized him, an older man now, smiling gently. "Mr. Dennis, it's been a long time." Richard nodded. "Too long." but I guess the coffee hasn't changed. The man poured him a cup, and the aroma filled the air. It reminded him of every morning spent waiting for the market to open, that electric pause before chaos began. He sat by the window, watching people rush by, their faces tense with deadlines and distractions. Everyone's trading something, he said quietly. Time, comfort, dreams, safety. Everyone's in the market whether they know it or not. He opened his notebook again, the one he always carried. On the first page he had written years ago, "Rules are the bridge between intention and action." He stared at the words. How simple they looked now, how heavy they had once felt. He began to write slowly. The market is a mirror, but most people look for approval, not truth. They want certainty in a place built on chaos. That's why they lose. He paused, tapped the pen, and continued. You can teach entry points and exits. You can teach money management, but you cannot teach someone to wait. Waiting is a kind of faith. He underlined the word faith. He had learned it the hard way, that trading wasn't a battle against numbers, but against impatience. The doorbell of the cafe chimed. A young man entered, laptop under his arm, phone in hand, earbuds in. He ordered quickly, his eyes never leaving the glowing screen. Dennis smiled to himself. He recognized that look, the hunger to conquer, the illusion of control. I was him once, he thought, and one day he'll be me. The young man sat nearby, scrolling through stock charts. His voice was low but excited as he spoke into a headset. It's breaking resistance. I'm going all in. Dennis looked at him for a moment, then said softly, Remember, son, the market rewards patience, not confidence. The young trader looked up, surprised. Do you trade? He asked. Dennis smiled faintly. Once, long enough to learn that the hardest trade is not taking one. The young man laughed nervously. Everyone says that, but timing is everything. Dennis nodded. Timing matters, but discipline decides. He took a sip of his coffee. Tell me, he said, what happens when you're wrong? The young man hesitated. I try again. Dennis leaned forward. No, you should learn again. There's a difference. The younger man fell silent. He didn't know who he was talking to, only that this older stranger's words carried the kind of weight that comes from mistakes. Dennis continued, his voice calm. Most traders think the market punishes them. It doesn't. It just reflects them. If you're chaotic inside, your results will be too. The young man nodded slowly. So you think trading is about psychology? Dennis smiled. Trading is psychology. Money just keeps the score. They talked for a while. The young trader asked questions about systems, about success, about fear. Dennis answered without formulas, without certainty, only experience. The best traders, he said, don't predict why they respond. They don't need to be right. They just need to survive long enough to see the truth. When the conversation ended, the young man thanked him and left, unaware he had just spoken to a legend. Dennis watched him go, then looked back at his notebook. He wrote again, slowly. Maybe that's how teaching works. You don't hand someone wisdom. You just plant a sentence and hope it grows. The cafe grew quieter. The morning rush had passed, leaving only the sound of spoons and quiet conversations. Dennis sat still, lost in thought. He remembered the faces of traders who couldn't let go, who clung to their systems like religion until the market humbled them. He whispered, The market isn't your enemy. It's your mirror. Learn to face it. He finished his coffee, stood up, and left a generous tip on the table. Outside, the city was alive again. Cars moved like arteries, people like blood cells flowing through them. Life, he thought, was just another kind of market, full of risks, full of cycles, full of lessons that repeat until you finally learn. He walked toward the park, the winter air crisp around him. Children were playing, laughing, their voices echoing across the frozen ground. He smiled. They don't know fear yet, he thought. That's why they move freely. He found a bench near the water and sat down. The surface of the pond rippled gently, reflecting the gray sky. He watched it for a long time. This, he said softly, is the only chart that matters, the one that teaches stillness. He closed his eyes. The sounds of the city faded. The wind brushed against his coat. For a moment, everything stopped. No trades, no signals, no profits, no losses. Just breath. Just presence. He whispered. Maybe that's what I was trying to teach all along. And in that silence, it felt like the market was listening. He sat there for a long time, eyes half closed, listening to the gentle rhythm of the wind. The city behind him moved like an organism. Horns, footsteps, distant voices. But to him it was just background noise. Inside his mind, the charts were finally still. The endless lines that once defined his life had softened into calm waves. Everything moves, he whispered, but not everything matters. The sound of the pond lapping against the shore brought him back. He looked at the water and saw his reflection ripple, disappear, return again. That, he thought, was the market, always changing, never gone. You don't fight the tide, he said quietly. You learn to float. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded note. It was something he had written years ago during the height of his fame. The paper was worn, the ink faded, but the words were still there. Follow the rules. Forget the outcome. He smiled faintly. You were right, he said to his younger self. You just didn't understand why. He unfolded another scrap of paper, a letter from one of the turtles, written long ago. The handwriting was shaky, but the message clear. Thank you for teaching me to trust myself, not the market. He read it slowly, line by line, letting each word sink in. That was the real victory. Not the money, not the headlines, not the fame, but the quiet transformation of a few lives that had learned to see the world differently. He looked up at the sky. Clouds drifted lazily, pale against the fading sun. So maybe it could be taught, he said softly. Not trading, but awareness. Maybe that was the lesson all along. A small gust of wind carried a few leaves across the path. He watched them tumble, weightless, directionless, yet somehow graceful in their fall. He whispered, "There's freedom in surrender." He thought of the years he had spent chasing control, the need to win, to prove, to predict. Now he saw it clearly. Control was an illusion. What mattered was rhythm, alignment, the courage to stay still when everything screamed to move. He leaned back on the bench, feeling the old wood creak beneath him. His thoughts drifted to William Eckhart again, the man who had challenged him all those years ago. You were right, Bill, he said with a smile. And so was I. He imagined his friend's voice, dry and amused. Maybe the truth lives somewhere in between. He laughed quietly, shaking his head. Between logic and luck, he said. Between rules and chaos. That's where the game really happens. A couple walked by, holding hands, whispering softly. He watched them with a kind of peace he hadn't known in years. They weren't chasing markets or fortunes. They were simply here, alive in the moment. Maybe wealth isn't what we think it is, he murmured. Maybe it's the ability to sit still and not need more. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but he didn't check it. Messages could wait. The market could wait. The world could wait. He took a slow breath and let it out, feeling the weight of decades drift off his shoulders. He closed his eyes again, and in the quiet of his mind, the trading floor came alive one last time. The roar of voices, the slam of orders, the dizzying dance of prices. He saw his younger self standing there, confident, unbreakable. And beside that image, he saw the classroom, the rows of turtles watching him, notebooks open, hope in their eyes. He heard his own voice from long ago. Trading isn't about predicting the future. It's about surviving the present. He smiled. Still true, he said softly. He imagined walking through that classroom one last time, telling them what he wished he'd known. He would say, the market doesn't test your strategy. It tests your soul. Every trade is a mirror. Look carefully. He would pause, then add, and when you lose, don't curse it. Thank it. It's the only teacher that never lies. The wind shifted. A faint drizzle began to fall, tiny drops dancing across the water's surface. He didn't move. The coolness felt clean, almost sacred. Rain, he whispered, the market of the sky. He watched it ripple, each drop creating a pattern, fleeting and beautiful. Everything's a chart if you know how to look, he said with a soft laugh. He felt a kind of closure then, not triumph, not regret, just balance. The cycle had completed itself. The boy who once believed he could control the market had become the man who finally understood he never needed to. The drizzle turned steady. He stood, brushing the moisture from his coat. The air smelled of rain and earth. He began walking back toward the city, his steps slow, steady, unhurried. With each step, he repeated quietly, almost like a mantra, follow the rules, forget the outcome. As he reached the edge of the park, he stopped and turned one last time toward the water. The rain had smoothed its surface, erasing the ripples, leaving only calm reflection. There it is, he said softly, the perfect trade. He smiled, not the smile of a man who had conquered anything, but of one who had finally let go. The noise of the city welcomed him back, but this time it didn't feel heavy. It felt alive. He slipped the worn note back into his pocket and walked toward the light of the street, blending into the rhythm of people, traffic, and time. The markets kept breathing, somewhere far away, unchanged and eternal. But Richard Dennis no longer needed to chase them. He had found what he was really looking for. Not certainty, but peace. And as the rain fell gently over the city, his last words to the wind were simple, almost tender. The experiment was never about money, he said. It was about understanding myself. He paused, smiled again, and whispered, "Lesson learned.